Hello, everybody. It is November 8th, 2025, here in the United States of America. And in today's video, I'd like to talk about this role that the United States continuously finds itself in, of being essentially the world's police officer, the world's hall monitor, the indispensable nation whose moral and righteous duty it is to preserve freedom all around the world and to ensure that nations aren't behaving aggressively towards one another and conquering large swaths of land in the name of authoritarianism. Now, this is a role that the United States found itself taking on after World War II. The new narrative was that there was a great crusade against fascism. That great crusade was won. Fascism was destroyed. Liberal democracy was restored. And then what replaced fascism as the enemy of the free West was communism. And there was a great crusade against communism over the next few decades, which resulted eventually in the breakup of the Soviet Union and the United States becoming the world's sole superpower, essentially replacing the role that the British Empire had filled for the previous 200 years. And it is seen as the moral duty of the United States to maintain this position because, and many people argue, that if the United States doesn't take on this role, then somebody else will. If the United States doesn't do it, then China will. China will become the world hegemon and control the planet. And that despite the flaws found within how the United States does things, that China would be that much worse. Now, is this really how Republicans and Democrats, the establishment, actually feels? Is it like a semi-religious, righteous crusade that they truly believe in, or is this just power politics to protect the interest of the United States? I would say it's the latter. There's no great moral and righteous reason for the way that the United States conducts itself in regards to its foreign policy other than just realpolitik. The United States wants to contain China where China is at, even though it seems to be a failing effort because of China's potential influence in the Western Pacific. The Pacific Ocean is entirely within the current American sphere of influence, especially since the end of World War II, that was seen as the spoils of victory. Once Imperial Japan was conquered, then the United States sort of took over the role of policing the Pacific and ensuring that no other empire from the East could rise again and challenge the United States dominance of the Pacific. So this is why there's a constant effort to contain China, to prevent what many policymakers in the United States see as an eventuality, because China actually easily could eventually usurp the United States as the world's sole remaining superpower. Because of its production capability, its economy, and how decision making isn't really hampered by an ineffective Congress and bureaucracy in the way that the United States is. China can make very quick decisions in regards to its foreign policy or the direction of its country because it is essentially an autocracy. Is China a communist country anymore? I'd say it's communist in name only, but it's more like, I'd say, state-run capitalism than anything else, with a communist veneer over the outside of it. But either way, it's very effective in what it does. It's in a very effectively run society, and no matter how many times people say China is on the brink of collapse, that never seems to happen. So that's one of the rules, one of the reasons why the United States refuses to pull back to its own borders and just focus on essentially just the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, as its sphere of influence, because the fear of China pushing the United States completely out of the Pacific. And then in regards to Russia, it's the same thing. Once the Soviet Union was broken apart, that was a great rival to the United States that was done away with, leaving the United States as the world's sole superpower. Now the Russian Federation, the largest republic, the largest state left over after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the state that arguably made up the core of the Soviet Union, still has great economic potential, has a large manpower pool to draw from, and has quite a bit of military equipment left over from the days of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union was producing tens of thousands of armored vehicles and tanks on its own. Now, the reason that there is such a concerted effort by some U.S. policymakers to ensure that Russia could never stand on its own 2 feet again is because of the power and influence Russia can exert on the Middle East and Central Asia because of its proximity to those regions and the power that it can exert over Eastern Europe. A resurgent and rising Russia makes the European Union afraid because the European Union does not have the collective power to stand up against a singular country with a singular direction when the European Union itself is made up of constantly bickering member states who can't seem to agree on anything and can't pull any kind of cohesive military together and refuse to function as one political entity, which is, I would say, the fault of European leaders as a whole. I did a video on the EU and why it's so inept and how it would be better off if it was actually functioning more as like a superstate that allowed for and catered to the nationalistic sensibilities of its member states, harkening back to the days of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And if Europe wants to be a superstate, well, then it needs to start conducting itself and managing itself as one, but until it manages to do that and comes to terms with the fact that Europeans tend to be very nationalistic and prideful people in their nations, and if it keeps fighting that, well, then it's never going to function in the way that its leaders want it to function. It's constantly shooting itself in the foot, so it's never going to be what it wants to be so long as it can't come to terms with the fact that Europeans don't want to feel like they're ruled by a bunch of neoliberal lunatics that hate their own people. But the reason why there was always such a concerted effort to contain Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, and that Russia wasn't given a leg up and wasn't taken seriously, was because the United States leadership, our policymakers and think tanks, still view Russia as a potential future threat. So China must be contained, and Russia must never be allowed to stand on its own 2 feet again because it threatens U.S. hegemony, which is why the U.S. is still heavily involved in Europe. Even after the fall of the Soviet Union, was to keep Russia contained. That's why we're still there. And this policy hasn't worked out very well. I'm sure, as everyone is aware now, Russia is resurgent. Russia is quickly improving its military and economic capabilities and has been for quite a long time. And I think the best thing that probably happened to the Russian military was the Russia-Ukraine war. It's helped the Russian military probably be the military with the most understanding of how modern warfare is going to look and the most experience fighting it. Russia now has the most experienced military on the planet, I would say, along with the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians are no joke. They're still holding on by their fingernails because they have a good military. It's outmatched and outnumbered, but it's still fighting, and fighting very well. And if the Ukrainians were to ever change their mind on who their enemy is and turn west, well, there's not much the Poles and Romanians could actually do to stop them with their knowledge of drone warfare and modern warfare in general. But the policy to contain Russia has backfired. The policy to contain China, I think, has backfired as well. We've staked a claim to Taiwan's independence despite the fact that we did sign on to the One China policy, and Taiwan is in a position where it cannot be defended by the United States Navy in any meaningful way. We actually risk the destruction of the entire Pacific Fleet trying to defend Taiwan, and I'm not the only one to say this. Our own Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, actually said that every simulated war game ends in the same way. China destroys the U.S. Pacific Fleet and whatever force is sent to try to save Taiwan from becoming part of mainland China once again. Also, too, with the Middle East, one of the reasons why we're still involved in the Middle East is to ensure that no one Arab power ever becomes dominant over the region. That the Middle East must constantly be broken up into smaller nations that bicker with one another, that don't have a cohesive military. And a lot of this has to do with protecting and preserving Israel as well, because it's in Israel's interest not to have a united Arab force at its borders, because Israel has nowhere to fall back to but the Mediterranean Sea. That's one of the reasons why we're so invested and involved in the Middle East. It's why we fought the first Gulf War. That's why we fought the second Gulf War. It's why we were in Afghanistan, and it's why we have periodically carried out airstrikes against Iranian interests to help out Israel. It's to make sure that there's not a regional hegemon. Now, Israel would love to be the regional hegemon, but I don't think the United States wants that either because of the relationship issues that it would cause with the oil-producing Middle Eastern nations like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, and Kuwait. So this really doesn't come down to some great moral crusade about preserving democracy or helping lift people from poverty or to protect oppressed people around the world. It's just it comes down to power politics. It's the United States attempting to maintain hegemony over the world, but what I think is going to happen is that policy is failing. The world can carry on with or without the United States, and as an American, my honest opinion on the matter is we don't need to be the world's hegemon. One of the reasons why nations in the past became expansionist and became empires was self-preservation. The Roman Republic felt like it needed to be the sole master of the Mediterranean and the sole master of most of Europe. Why? Because it faced constant threats from the Gauls to the north, the Germanic tribes, Cimbrians, Averni, and then also the Carthaginians. Rome fought a series of bloody wars, and also the Greeks as well. Rome fought a series of bloody wars against its rivals, and to ensure its own survival as a political entity, it eliminated those rivals one by one until it became master of the Mediterranean. But the Roman Empire knew its limits. It didn't expand much further into Germania than it did at its maximum extent because there was a war that wasn't worth fighting. It never expanded permanently into the northern British Isles because, again, it wasn't a battle worth fighting. It never took over Ireland. And its pushes into the Middle East were never really met with much great success. The Parthian Empire and the various Persian empires were always just a thorn in the sides of the Romans, but the Romans could never expand far enough to eliminate that threat. Now, the United States, though, on the other hand, we actually live essentially in a fortress. We have a weak neighbor to the north, a weak neighbor to the south, and the Atlantic and the Pacific on both sides. We are at a completely geographically safe position. We are under no immediate threat of invasion by anybody, really. And we have almost every natural resource you could imagine here within our own territory. Our sphere of influence extends into the Pacific Ocean, extends through Central and South America, and extends up through Canada. I think most Americans instinctively realize this and know that this policy of containment against Russia and China, when we ourselves are not actually directly threatened by either nation. Now, our interests in the Western, it would technically be the Western Pacific, I guess, sure, would be threatened by China. I mean, we view the Pacific as basically our backyard, but as far as like mainland America goes, no, there's no threat from the Chinese to mainland America, and the same thing goes for Russia. Russia can exert influence in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe, but Russia is not a direct threat to the United States of America. So this empire we are attempting to maintain, its purpose really seems to be to prevent a giant what if. Not an immediate current threat, but it's to protect United States interests from a resurgent Russia and a resurgent China. It's to protect our interests in the Middle East from a united Arab front. It's to preserve the post-Cold War status quo, and that's really it. It has nothing to do with some great moral cause. We're not doing it because we're truly the indispensable nation. It's just power politics on a global scale, and I think it's failing miserably. I think it's unnecessary. Sure, there's bad things that could happen if the United States wasn't constantly trying to keep peace around the world, but there's also plenty of bad things that probably won't happen. And I think there's a lot of fatigue in this country over constantly addressing issues all around the world, spending our money, intervening in other nations, constantly propping up other governments in some giant chess game with Russia and China. I think many of Americans feel at this point it frankly just isn't worth it because they're not our neighbors. They're not direct threats to the territorial integrity of the United States. So is there really any need to maintain this expansionist empire all around the world at this point? And this isn't me giving some great moral speech or stance on the issue. I just don't think it's sustainable or practical at this point in this country's history, especially with all the domestic problems that we have. If the United States cannot focus solely on its domestic issues at a time of relative peace in the world, then it faces even more internal turmoil to the point where things might actually get pretty bad here when people become frustrated enough. Perhaps we'll go into our own period of time where the nation is constantly embroiled in a series of civil conflicts until it can finally figure itself out and form a government that can maintain order and peace for an extended period of time. But anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about in this video today. I will be back Tuesday with another video about American domestic politics, and I'm actually going to try to do a live stream tomorrow afternoon at some point, probably around, I'm going to shoot for 3 or 4. It'll be about an hour-long live stream, so anybody who's interested, please tune in then, and I will be on here. And if you like this content, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And until then, have a good one.